I started attending the Shabbos Farbrengens approximately in the age of 6 or 7 years old. We lived in Williamsburg, but my family would walk in every Shabbos Farbrengens. We'd leave Williamsburg about 12 o'clock. We'd get to Crown Heights a little before 1, so we had a chance to have a bais and go to Farbrengens. Of course, in those years already, the Farbrengens started with a Seder V'Sudah. It started every time at 1:30 sharp. In the early years, when the Rebbe came into a Farbrengen, the place was so quiet, I'll use an exaggerating expression, you could hear a pin drop, as opposed to later, which I'll talk about later. It was quiet. The Rebbe came in, went to his place, sat down, made Kiddush most of the time. After Kiddush, he would turn around and say L'chaim to the people behind him. Then he would say L'chaim a little bit to the crowd in a very general way. And then after that, they would start singing. The first nigun would be sung then, and people would start saying L'chaim to the Rebbe at that point. That's how the Farbrengens start. Farbrengens start in the early chafs, perhaps before also, but I can only tell you what I remember. And there was the first sikha. First sikha usually was Minyan de Yoma. Second sikha usually was a continuation of the first sikha. Then there was a mimer or a sikha kein mimer. Then in Chafei, as we'll get to a little later, or perhaps I can jump to Chafei, the Rebbe started after the mimer, after the sikha kein mimer, the Rebbe started learning a Rashi every week. Then a few years later, again I'm jumping years, the Rebbe started saying Biyurim on his father and Teres Leib Yitzchak. And the reason he started then because the Pashtus, that's when it became available. The Rebbe brought the manuscripts and they started printing them, and the Rebbe started saying it. But this is in the late Chavs, or I don't remember the exact year, or the early Lamets. But I jumped years, so I would like to be more specific how things progressed. The type of nigunim that was sung. First thing usually was a Chassidish nigun, as opposed to in the Lamed, it went from a Chassidish nigun, it went to a nigun that was kapitel. The first thing would be the nigun for the Rebbe's kapitel in Tillim, but till then it was a Chassidish nigun. After the first sikha was again a Chassidish nigun, unless the Rebbe asked otherwise. The happy nigun started usually towards the end of the Farbrengen. Again, unless the Rebbe asked or specified otherwise. I can't tell you what happened in the early Yud, because I was a baby, I was born in Yud Aleph, but I can tell you that in the later Yuds and in the early Chavs, basically the Rebbe would Farbrengen every Shabbos Farbrengens, or a Shabbos after Yom Tov, or before Yom Tov, or Shabbos after Yom Pagra, like Yud Kislev, or Yud Shevat, or Yud Beis Tammuz. Otherwise, Farbrengens were only Shabbos Mevarchim. It was ever Farbrengen. Otherwise, it was a big Chiddush. In Chafei, a new system started. The Rebbe Farbrengen every Shabbos that year. That's the year Vov Tishrei, the Rebbe Sechana passed away, the Rebbe's mother. And then in Chav Vav, it went back to the old Seder, but Farbrengens were more frequent than it was until Chafei. In other words, till the end of Chav Daled. In other words, not every week, but by every Yom Pagra, it would be the week after and the week after. Not always. It wasn't necessarily always a set way, but the Farbrengens were much more frequent. I was told, I can't say I remember, in the early years, the Rebbe came out a half an hour after davening, or 20, whatever it was after davening. So whenever davening finished, the Rebbe would come out after, if he Farbrengen, he would come out 20 minutes or half, whatever it was after that davening. Then, certain stories went around. Somebody had a bar mitzvah, and he said the Rebbe is going to Farbrengen, and it's going to make nobody should come to the bar mitzvah. So the Rebbe said he won't start the Farbrengen until 1:30, and that's when the Seder started. I don't know what year, but what I do remember clearly when I was growing up, the Farbrengens started 1:30 sharp. You can practically set your clock on it. My memory tells me, Bacharim, even if the davening finished at a quarter to 12 or 12 o'clock, Bacharim did not go home. A Bachar that went home was considered a Balabat Shabachar. Sometimes you had where your mother, your father insisted that you came home out of Kibbutz Aveim, you would go home but run back right away. Mostly Bacharim stayed. They helped set up the tables, helped Rabbi Harlik set up the tables. They would get their places. They became his kivurim, but the Bacharim would want to be there. In other words, they would roll from the davening. They would make kiddush and pavais and kichlach. There was no herring like they have today with kiddushin. It was basically kedem wine or slinger in the later years, or slinger in the early years. And it's not important the name of the wine. Just I happen to remember the names, the labels, and kichlach. And we all waited, anticipated with anticipation for the Rebbe to come in. We all stood in our places, not 5 minutes before the Rebbe came in. We stood in our places at least a half an hour, 45 minutes before the Rebbe came in. Never a zman kavua for bringing to end. That non-existent. In the early years, I understand from what I heard. The Rebbe, that's not my memory, it's just what I heard. That the Rebbe would usually an hour and a half, 2 hours. When I was a young bacher, before my bar mitzvah, after my mitzvah, the Farbrengens were longer than that already. They would come at 1:30. Usually Farbrengens would go till 4:30. As the years went on, Farbrengens got longer and longer. It came to a point once where the Rebbe, even in the winter, the Rebbe Farbrengt, they'd have minche, and about 10 minutes later, they'd have meidev. In other words, the Rebbe didn't even go back to his room. Sometimes he did, sometimes he did. In the beginning, he did. And they would have meidev upstairs in a small val, although the Farbrengt was downstairs. But in the later years, the Rebbe would Farbrengt quite late. I mean, late is relative, because in the winter, the shkia is 4:30. And in the summer, the shkia is like more after 8 o'clock. Then in between, you have the hours in between. But that was in the winter. In the summer, it happened very seldom where they would Farbrengt that late. It happened once or twice where they would Farbrengt till after 7. But that was an exception. But usually, the average Farbrengt would finish about 4:30-ish. Again, I'm talking about the 60s now. The chafs and lamed, they got longer. But again, it was totally in the shkia. So there's different kufas, different times of the year, and different kufas. The Rebbe spoke very loud. The shul was very quiet. The first shul up to Tafshin Chav Ches, the shul was only what we know now as the back of the shul. In other words, Shalash, the original Shalash, the courtyard of 70, that was built into a shul. I would say that's size, off the top of my head, I would say 30 by 60, 30 by 70. And it was a high ceiling, but the Rebbe spoke loud. As a matter of fact, the first few years there was no panels, and it made it easier for us to hear the Rebbe, because the Rebbe's voice would bounce off the stone walls. And later, when you put panels, wood is softer and has a tendency to absorb sound. But it was the Rebbe's voice. The Rebbe spoke very loud. Later, in the later years, I mean, if you're talking about the mems, the late mems or the early nuns, I sat by Farbrengens. I heard the Rebbe's voice. I couldn't distinct the words. And I wasn't that far from the Rebbe. A lot of Bacharim would sit under the Rebbe's bima, but the normal thing was Bacharim tried to get good places. And if you had a place that was far away, and you had an average hearing capabilities, you didn't hear. You only heard the Rebbe's voice, unless when the Rebbe would get sometimes intensified in the Sikha, he would raise his voice. But normally, a lot of us heard the Rebbe on Shabbos. I mean, during the week with a mic, but I'm talking about Shabbos now. Rashi's Sikhs started Shabbos Bereshis Tafshin Chafei. It was something that Rebbe Leila Nishmas, his mother. And he started talking Rashi Sikh every week. It was Farbrengen every week. The Rebbe started the Rashi Sikhs then. The Sikhs and the Rashi Sikh was always, as I mentioned before, was always after the Maimer or the Sikhikein Maimer. It was towards the end of the Farbrengen. Rashi Sikhs were mostly, that I would ask bunch of questions. They would sing. Then there would be Hafsakin. They would sing a niggin. Where the chassanim would go up. I think at that point the chassanim went up to give the Baal Zamashki for their wedding. But that's a conversation itself. But then the second sikha of Rashi would be the answers to the questions. And then as years went on, there was once Shabbos where the Rebbe asked 14 questions, and he didn't give any answers, and he told the Olam they should write in answers, and in Mivtza Hashem, the next Shabbos, we will give the answers, and a lot of them will be based on the answers he gets. Then we'll go to the next step, would be the Geras HaTshuvah. The Rebbe would say a sikh every week. I forgot what year it was. The Rebbe said a sikh every week on the Geras HaTshuvah, which was a Chiddush. They printed, then maybe boys saw it, you didn't see it. Small blue Geras HaTshuvahs. Like Bacham had a Minchamayim in their pocket, every Bacham had a Geras HaTshuvah in their pocket. And the Rebbe spoke about the Geras HaTshuvah every week. That lasted, I believe, less than a year, maybe a year, I'm not sure. Then the Rebbe started talking Sikhs, saying Sikhs on the Kutalev Yitzchak and his father's Titus. That lasted till Nun Beis. It started in the late Chav to the early Lamed. The Rambam, the Rebbe started discussing Rambam, of course, when the Rebbe came up with the Tekolim, the Rambam, which I believe is in Tafshim Mem Dalad. That's the Rebbe started saying Sikhs on the Lim the Rambam, and he would say a Sikh pertaining mostly to the Shir of Shleisha Prakim Liyim, but from time to time, the Rebbe would also address the Perek Echad Liyim, but most of the time, the Sikh was about the Rambam from those days, from that day, from the day before, the day after, pertaining to the people who are learning Shleisha Prakim Liyim. Again, from time to time, he would say a word addressing the Rambam that was for the people who learned Perek Echad Liyim. As a matter of fact, I just noticed, saw a sikha the other day that mentioned that this week is punkt that the ones who are learning Shleisha Prakim Liyim and the Perek Echad Liyim coincides. And the Rebbe said a sikha, and at the time he smiled and he said, everybody can participate in listening to the sikha. I don't know if those are the words, but the Rebbe made note of it, that it's a day that the guys who are learning the Rambam say the Perek Echad Liyim, the Shleisha Prakim Liyim is the same Perek today. If the Rebbe wanted to talk sharp, it was it was always on Shabbos, for the simple reason that it was recorded and it didn't go public. And in general, the Rebbe spoke a different tone on Shabbos than during the Farbrengens during the week. I mean, the recordings from the week you can all hear. Shabbos you can hear the recordings, but it was a different tone, a different type of Farbrengen. It was even different than Yom Tov. Shabbos Farbrengens was a certain, I'm not going to mimic it, but there was a different tone, different, like Yud Shevat. The Rebbe started off Yud Shevat once. I heard the recording many times. Peschi midvar malchus, ma malka rabbanon. Shabbos wasn't that way. I guess when the Rebbe spoke to the mic and then with the hookups, he was talking to the bell, so he was talking slower because perhaps they weren't used to the Rebbe's sikhs and the Rebbe wanted them to understand. But Das Elliot, I don't know, but I do know that the signon, the tone of talking was different. Now, talking about Chazorah, meaning that if Farbrengen, there was Chazorah, basically it was Yale, after Mincha or after Farbrengen, depending again, if it was a summer Shabbos, it would be right after Farbrengen. They wouldn't even bother having Mincha yet. Yale would sit down with a few of his protégés, and a lot of other Bach would sit around them, but mostly next to him sat the guys with the very good memories and paid attention to the Sikhs very closely. And they would Plam Chazorah. Most of the time, I would say, I don't like to go into numbers. Most Bachrim would attend Chazorah, and even Balabatim attended Chazorah. Not all Balabatim, most Balabatim went home, but you had certain Balabatim that had a very Tziddish Hergish, and they wanted to hear Chazorah. Some of them couldn't anymore, they had no Kayach, older people especially. Well, one Shabbos, I missed that Farbrengen. This is in Tufshin and Aleph. I'm jumping to much later years. The Rebbe Farbrengen twice. So it was the Shabbos after Shavuos. The Rebbe Farbrengen came down and he washed. I'm sure the story is written someplace, but that's one thing that stands out. That's like the Rebbe Farbrengen twice on Shabbos. Otherwise, the Yud Shevat HaGadol, the Rebbe Farbrengen, meaning Tafshel Lamed. The Rebbe Farbrengen Shabbos, he Farbrengen again Mivtza Shabbos, but that wasn't twice on Shabbos. Mivtza Shabbos was with a mic, was a different style of Farbrengen. A lot of dignitaries came, and what have you. Then, of course, he had the Farbrengen before Shabbos. So actually, within a 28-hour range, 29-hour range, you had City Farbrengen. Erev Shabbos, Shabbos afternoon, and Mivtza Shabbos. But Shabbos was one Farbrengen then. Two Farbrengens on Shabbos happened at Shabbos after Shavuos. Happened where there was a maimer in his room in the early years before Shachris, but that I would call that a Farbrengen. That was the Rebbe's room maimer. As far as Farbrengen goes, most Shabbosim, not most, basically Shabbosim had one Farbrengen. As far as having a place for Farbrengen, and the chafren was already set. Everyone had their mug kavua, which wasn't really fair, but that's the way it went. Otherwise, it'd be a fight every week. But when the bachrim or visitors came from out of town, they wanted to get a good place. The good places were all taken by the mekemis kavurim. So if you had a cousin or a good friend, who would squeeze you in next to him. But if you didn't, you were in trouble. Unless you were a chavraman and you fought your way in. In any event, right after my mitzvah, I wanted to have a good place. So, but on Kaddish, there was no table. Nobody wanted to stand by on a Kaddish. It's not respectful. But I was creative. So I went ahead and I built a table. The length of the table was the width of the on Kaddish. So, and it was a regular height table, 30 inches high. I built it myself. And it had 4 other guys standing with me. Yossi Hecht from South Africa, Itche Pekarski from Tel Aviv, and one more bacher was and Geshe Schusterman. He was like the honorary guest. He was the one that stood in front. I mean, he was older than us. As a matter of fact, he was my CIT counseling on his cell phone, like, that's what my name is.